Okay, for those people out in the ether who aren't here, I'm introducing you to Helen Rosenau, born in Monte Carlo in Monaco, but grew up in Germany. But I'm going to ask myself, why are we going to talk about her? Because she didn't manage to survive very long in Germany. She was in 1932 forced to leave as the National Socialists came to power, and she was removed from her university scholarship. And she eventually, with her mother, escaped through Switzerland and came to Britain, where she was supported by the British Federation of University Women, who ran a particular program for refugee women scholars. And that is how she comes to be part of our story. Now, this letter that I was talking about is a letter which was in 1982, thinking about having her book republished 40 years after she originally published it. Okay, and here's a lovely little copy of her, image of her copy, my copy as she's written, so she obviously kept it and was hoping for it to be republished. Now, my question to myself was she inspired by the eruption of feminist art history across the 1970s to think, why isn't my book part of it? So if you look across the top, you can see by the dates, kind of a plethora of feminist work that is appearing, particularly in the United States, from Linda Naughlin's essay in Art News, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, republished in Art and Sexual Politics, to an exhibition of old mistresses, to our hidden heritage, 5 centuries of, get rid of that, can we? No. 5 centuries of women artists, and then what you're missing is every title is about women artists, right? Now, that's a very important thing to think, because you think that's probably what feminism is about. It's telling you that there are women artists. We're going to find out that that's not quite the case. In Britain, Germaine Greer came up with a slightly different approach to that, which was the obstacle race, in which she looked at the fortunes of women painters and their work, offering a social psychology of their failure. They could not be great because of the damage to their egos caused by living in a patriarchal society. So we can't search for the great women artists, but we can find various stories of these, well, damaged folk. Okay, so we're not too fond of that one. And then Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology, arrives just at the same time. It has a rather complicated history. This is the British version, which actually has a woman of color on the front. The Americans decided nobody would understand that, so they changed the cover when they gave the American version. And then we have a French feminist contribution in 1977, which is the history of art and the lutte des sexes, Histoire de l'art et lutte des sexes, as it were, sex struggle, gender struggle, which was to reply to the Marxists who came up with the idea of the history of art and class struggle. Okay, so we've got an interesting range in Europe of more analytical, psychological, theoretical, ideological readings, whereas this whole group at the top are what you'll see is a kind of classic form of art history, which is an art history of artists, not a history of art. Okay, so we've got that. Okay, now why did Helen Rosenau propose, why did what she proposed in this book become so completely invisible by 30 years after its publication? Why was its memory lost by the time my generation found itself compelled, but in ignorance of her work, to re-enter this conversation, but so differently? And what do we and I particularly learn by considering this book in the context or the conditions of its emergence, which means we have to go back and look at the history of art history in the 20th century in Britain, and also the context in which I became compelled to think about it, which is effectively, this is not working at all. No, it is, but my Coca-Cola's in the way. Okay, I don't mind that. Okay, don't go off of it. Okay, thank you. Okay, because it is interesting what makes it possible now to do this kind of thinking about the past, because you're being trained as art historians or fine artists thinking about art history, to go back and say, if we can find the detail, we just kind of tell the story of how things happened, but they don't happen sequentially. Oblivion, a lack of memory, a loss of memory is as easy to produce as indeed this memory. So whatever you think is the memory of art history, the stories you're being told are fundamentally partial, selective, exclusionist, and at worst distorting. Okay, so let's just look at this little book. Now, it's a very interesting book because 1944, it's plastic bound. So any of typographers are interested in design. It's paperback. Paperbacks had only been come into being in the late 30s. It cost about £9, 5 shillings. It's 100 pages, 55 illustrations, only in black and white. And it has on the cover one of the oldest objects that we have in the history of at least the European world, called From Willendorf, a little place in Austria. It's misnamed, but we're just going to call it a Willendorf figure. It was, however, only excavated in 1908. That means it only becomes part of cultural memory or of the historical imagination at the beginning of the 20th century, which in a sense will introduce it into the world of art at the point at which modernism is questioning a particular Christianocentric, Eurocentric trajectory of art. So we will see this as a significant thing, and you can see how small it is. It's 11 centimeters high. For me, my generation, it's about 4 inches. I can get that one if I can think of it in inches still. Okay, and on the back, we have that it's Isomorph number 1. Isomorph was a really interesting Bauhaus-influenced publishing company, directed by this man called Anthony Froshaug. And anybody who's interested, there's a book by Robin King-Ross all about his archive is down in Brighton. And this was the only book that Isomorph, this new press he invented, produced. It had to be academic, it had to have footnotes, but it was going to be cheap, easy, and accessible. So it's an interesting aspect of it. But the other issue we'll come to is that it has Barbara Hepworth on the cover. Go back that way. Overlaid with something so new. Okay. So radical publishing, modernist publishing, really at the sort of front end of this work matters to us because we're also going to find ourselves thinking about art publishing itself. So you can see there's something slightly disproportionate in this little book and then this massive book. And if you look very carefully, the little book is actually the grey pages. We have reprinted it. We've put it in color. We've put it in this high level book. So why is the book so big? Well, first of all, we have to introduce who Helen Rosenau is, a memoir by our former head of school, Professor of Fine Art, Adrian Rifkin, who was a student of Rosenau's. Then there is a history of her, or analysis of her experience as a German Jewish refugee scholar in Britain by Rachel Dixon from the Ben-Uri Gallery. And then there's an intellectual portrait of Rosenau as a thinker, which is by none other than me. And then we print the original book in the middle of it. And then it took me all these months and years to read the book, to make sense of it, to put together the context in which it became intelligible to me, because nothing in my art historical education to that point, the feminist stuff that we'd done, prepared me for it, because it belonged to a world from the 20s and 30s and 40s in art history that I had never been taught and put aside as irrelevant, which was a mistake. But so when I did the reading of the little book, I had to analyze the cover and the title. Why is it called Woman in Art? What does it mean to be from type to personality? What I was told if I studied the preface and the foreword. How did she use illustrations to make an argument in art history? What is the context for her research? How did she go about putting this book together? I studied the bibliography, which wasn't there, so I had to make one up from all the references and then understand the intellectual resources with which she was working. I then had to give situated readings, i.e. readings from the 2020s of a book published in 1944, and understand not with the kind of arrogance that it's very easy for us to say, oh, these poor benighted folks, you know, they didn't yet have queer theory, they weren't thinking in post-colonial terms, they weren't attuned to all the anxieties that we have now. And she would say ordinate sentence, but how do we understand that, not in that kind of condescending way that they were a little backward at the time, but learn to understand that it was being formulated. The questions we formulate now in identitarian terms were being formulated in very different ways of thinking about questions of race, class, gender, desire, sexuality, and life. And then I had to put it in the terms of feminism, or indeed in terms of what I call women's time, arts time, Jewish time, and how to situate these different histories that intersect in her book. So let's look at the chapters of her book. When I first read this, I thought, wives and lovers, motherhood, and further aspects of creativeness. This is not going to be an interesting project. It seems so conventional. You immediately think, oh, goodness me, this is all very, very heterosexual, sexist. This is all very much to do with concepts of women as being either wives and lovers or mothers, and then maybe they were sometimes a little bit creative on the outside of the domestic sphere. But we're going to have to understand what she's talking about, which is so different from our identitarian notions now and our concepts of gender. So at the core of this is the idea that woman is a symbolic form. I see illumination breaking out all over the room, right? No, so what does it mean? A symbolic form is a form of thought. It's a form through which you can try and think something other than what it is that you are is in golden. So we're not saying there are women or woman, but it is, as we'll see later, kind of a mythic idea, but also a form through which certain concepts of relationality, of desire, of the generation of life, of the imminence of death, of the passions of the body are going to be thought, right? So we can center an art history on woman as a site of symbolic thinking. And I'm going to explain symbolic thinking slightly differently. But if we think of it through sociology and anthropology, as well as psychology, the central questions of what is a person, why are there different types of people, what is sexuality, what is sexual desire, what is the process by which there is more than one generation of human beings, right? People participate in it in different sorts of ways to produce this. And when we look at it anthropologically, the question of marriage is almost a universal institution. And even in, for instance, contemporary discourse about gay marriage, people want forms or civil partnerships. They need forms by which, when couples get together, property is going to be shared or transmitted or preserved. So marriage is a legal institution we find in almost all cultures for the purposes of transfer of property. As modern time goes on, as we can see, it develops certain notions of affection, of desire, of companionship, all sorts of different ways of understanding what any couple, and I don't know, it's a straight couple, but any couple is involved when they are either bound by law against their wills or bound by choice and live a life of a different kind. Okay, so if we can take that under this idea of erotic relations of desire, passions of the body, social roles, generational change, and then overlay it with the modern political struggle amongst certain people caught up in the marriage, in this legal systems, these theological, legal, social, psychological sets of relationships, we are going to find it also the site for an exploration of creativity and agency. So I hope that gives you some sense that we are in a territory where anthropology, psychology, sociology is going to impinge on the categories that we're looking at. And that means we have to jump out of the, as it was, straitjacket of our contemporary thinking, but also see anticipations of it. So if we put some of the images together, how does art give us access to that? Not because we're going to tell you who made each of these works. I'm sorry, I don't know why. I think I just close that one down. Okay, but because we have inscriptions in forms or formulations of these sets of relations. So the Etruscans are very interesting because they're lying down and they are in a certain way that the couple, this particular marital couple, is represented. We get the Romans introducing the idea that you mark a marriage by the crossing of hands. And you've done the Arnolfini marriage portrait, you'll see that's why they think that's a marriage portrait, because there's this particular sign of taking the right hand. You have Orpheus and Eurydice, a kind of, marriage as a passionate relationship, a humorous relationship. Here you have on the bottom, the Fawcett's, the two, an MP and Millicent Fawcett, who has seen a statue of her put up in Parliament Square, one of the founders of the suffrage movement. You've got Pierre and Marie Curie, a partnership of scientific invention. And here you've got Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the two who founded the LSE, the London School of Economics. So we're beginning to re-look at formulations of pairs that are not necessarily signifying the act of marriage, but some kind of process of partnership or companionship, which can be interpreted in different ways. If we look at the diverse representations of motherhood, we will also find, these are the images from her book, a number of different ways in which motherhood can be understood as a generational relationship between an older person and a younger person in which life becomes. So you can figure the mother, you can figure maternal subjectivity, you can have a concept of mothering without ever having any children. You can have a motherhood which is bereaved because you lose children or don't lose a pregnancy. You could have sacralized mother goddesses who represent a concept of infinite mothering, like Diana of Ephesus, or you can have motherhood as an elective affinity, as you see in the story of Naomi and Ruth and Naomi and Orpah, where a woman chooses to affiliate herself to a mother who's lost her children and to take their place. And here we have Feuerbach's portrait of his stepmother, who never had children, but is adopted by him as an elective mother. So we're beginning to also explore not just formulations of ideas, but also formulations of affect, of emotions and affiliations and feelings. Okay. And then we can find that she's going to represent, how do you represent power and politics through the female body, with Hatshepsut from the first Queen of Egypt, the Empress Matilda, a very famous, very, very powerful figure in British history and in European history, the Empress Maria Theresa of the Habsburg Empire. And we also have intellect and poetry. We had intellects and poetry, but we don't seem to have it moving on anymore. Okay, we're going to get, sorry, we did go too far, but we'll leave it. So you had those poets, you can have revolutionaries. Sorry, we're going to go back. No, sorry. So this is a PC person, I mean, a Mac person who's trying to make sense of a PC. So, anyway. So there are different types. So here we've got revolutionaries, from the woman who's executed in the French Revolution, Olympe de Gouges, who wrote the Vindications of the Life of the Rights of Women to compensate with the rights of man, right the way down to Teresa Billington Greaves, a very famous suffragette, who now in the 1940s, when this picture was still an activist. You can have an anthropologist, a sociologist, you could have a composer, all of these very good if you're planning to be on University Challenge, learn these names, and when they ask you about women, all the students always look at, why should I know about them? Oh, I need to make sure you do. Okay. Okay, but there's also transnational, intercultural. She is going to explore the questions of how marriage is represented in India through the figure of Sati. This is the image of Buddha's mother. Very interesting view. She's looking at certain kinds of ways in which the figuration occurs in West African art, how it occurs then in socialist iconography here in the very famous thing, the pavilion, Soviet pavilion in 1936 in Paris. So this is not just a Eurocentric story. It explores medieval Chinese representations of ways in which bodies and minds are explored medically and scientifically, but also religious law, how religious law affects class and sexuality, divorce. We're not quite sure what L'Année is by Toulouse-Lautrec, whether it's an image of an unhappy couple, working class couple, or a man with a very dissatisfied a prostitute with a dissatisfied client. But Rosenau is very, very touched with this wonderful image. She says, how rare do you ever see images of romantic passion of working class people in the late 19th or early 20th century and early Picasso. So you can see that what she's asking us to do in the work of studying the history of art is not to study artists. I've not told you the name of, apart from Picasso, I'm sorry about that, names. We're looking at figurations, ways in which ideas are given a form in different cultures, in different moments in history by different means. And she concludes with the self-articulation as a creative subject through a series of particularly interesting in the self-portrait, culminating with this, what seems like an abstract image, but of course is the image of singularity. It's just a single form. Right? It's a statement of someone there who's alone, or a being or a presence, which is part and parcel of what these other images are in their own languages producing. Now, so why did I write this big book? Well, we have to go back to 1979 for a moment, because there is Helen Rosenau, a retired art historian from the University of Manchester, a feminist since the 1920s, and here is Griselda Pollock, at this point, a PhD student, clearly a feminist activist, who became a lecturer at the University of Manchester a few years after Rosenau retired, but never was referenced to that, and came to Leeds in 1970. So we like ships we missed. I was just a little feminist trying to get my hold on the world, on art history and on feminism. She was a distinguished and then a retired person. But there is a strange and touching coincidence I want to share with you, which is her last book, which was commissioned by this publisher, Oresco, touches me in a particular way. Oresco commissioned my first two publications, so I was established. That's how I got my job at Leeds, because I'd had 2 books published, which was good. But he also commissioned and would have published Old Mistresses. So there's a chance that Rosenau's last manuscript and my first big feminist manuscript lay on the same desk. I find that very moving in a strange, curious kind of way. But no point did anybody mention her to me. No point was there any understanding that she might be a precedent for the kind of intervention that Rosie and I were making, because we didn't write about women artists, but women art and ideology, which was closer, in a sense, to what she was doing. And there's the sad history that the book was given to Oresco. He sold it to a pornographer. Rosie and I had to steal it back from the pornographer. He sued us, so we had to buy it back from that, and finally it got published. So we never made any money out of this book. Now, you have to understand that art history in the 1940s didn't exist in Britain as a degree subject, right? Britain, alone about the Europeans, didn't produce an art history. They had professors of art history who had no students. So when art history develops in Britain in the mid-20th century, it's going to meet at the intersection of 2 different traditions. One is British connoisseurship, Burlington Magazine, and collecting. So you need to train people to look after your collections and discern whether you've got a Michelangelo or it's a copy, versus this European philosophical cultural investigation that's talking a bit like me, to symbolic forms and formulations. And the reason that art history gets transformed in Britain and expanded is of mass immigration of Jewish intellectuals forced out of Europe by the rise of National Socialism, fascism. The impact is that they then get jobs, but not everybody gets the jobs, and we'll see this. So the Courtauld Institute, you may know, was founded only in 1932. There are no art historians in Britain to populate it. So mostly for the 30s, there were what I call the wandering Jews were imported in order to teach art history to young people like Anthony Blunt. Okay, and then there was the Warburg Library, which had been founded in Hamburg. And you need to know about Hamburg because that's where Rosenau was studying. transferred to London in 1934, and then took on this modernist building in 1958. So we are seeing art history transformed by the events of Europe, the rise of fascism, which is going to expel a very large number of European-trained art historians who will bring a completely different intellectual tradition. Now, let me pose this question. Why did I write a big book about a very little book? Let me pose it again. Well, partly, now I have to read this out because there are people, maybe you're still seeing it on there, to illuminate the critical condition of art history in Britain then and now. It's important because we don't teach art historiography classes as we should do about what is at stake in the manner. Now in Leeds, we don't have to because we can take cultural studies courses, you get lectured by different people who bring that European tradition of thinking syncretically, structurally, into an art history which is given to being rather narrative. But I need also to define the stakes for what is misunderstood as feminist in our field now. Because most of what you'll think of feminist, which is why I brought my book, is naming female artists. So that's what the Americans call it. We call them women artists for some interesting reason. Now, the critical importance of this book and the stakes for us and how we can use it now is that there were two major publications in this emergent landscape of art history in the mid-20th century. One is Rosenau's book, Woman in Art, which is a feminist social historical analysis of woman as a symbolic form analyzed through images in a small independent publisher, small print run, sold out. And the other was a book produced by a stray research fellow at the Warburg, who had written a book about art history for children and was commissioned by Phaidon to write it on a larger scale, and it produced, therefore, an infantile history of art. This is an infantile project, and it matters because in 1946 to 50, he created an anti-materialist, anti-social, and patriarchal art history for the mid-20th century. Now, does that matter? Well, of course it does matter because this conservative positivist refugee art historian writes a book which is, as I say, infantilizing us. He has become probably the most famous art historian. You probably have heard of Ernst Gombrich. You probably had The Story of Art in your school library, or somebody gave it to you for a present when they heard you were interested in art. But he says there is really no such thing as art. There are only artists. And for him, artists are only men, or only men are artists. So we're going to call it not the story of art, but the story of artists. Because it says nothing about art as a form of thinking, as a form of making, as a process, as a complex ideological operation. But since it sold 8 million copies in 30 languages and is in its 17th edition, this is massive because as I've been talking to people, there is no one that I have spoken to who's in the field who says, I've never heard of Gombrich. They all say, oh, that was the book I was given. That's the book we used at school. That's the book, right? So the telling of this story created by my generation and a process of having to undo the normalization of this vision. Are there any women in Gombrich's book? 0. 17 editions, 0. One German edition mentions 1 woman. So if any of you are women fine artists or interested in women, this is really a zero-sum game. Okay, now we have to move to publishing. So I brought this lovely book to show you, which is another, see, my style, I'm kind of copying these. This is Phaidon, because how do you get to know about art history? You have to have publishers. So she had little Frosthaug, but Phaidon published Story of Art. It had been founded in Vienna and was one of these other intellectual imports resulting from the flight from fascism of Bella Horowitz, Ludwig Goldscheider, and Fritz. They come to London in 1937, and what do they publish? A name, an artist. Bellini, Donatello, Da Vinci, Van Gogh, again, producing this idea that there's a history of art, which is a history of artists. Then we get Thames and Hudson, so we've got two publishers, also from the Jewish refugee community, founded in 1949. Their first book was very interesting, on English cathedrals. Very perplexing, but we'll leave that alone. So these people form part of a group called the Hitler emigres. Now, emigres were in fact French nobles who during the French Revolution thought, we better just hop over to another country since they're cutting off most of our heads. They'd go probably with a certain amount of fear behind them, but they take their money with them and they're just fine. Refugees are people who arrive with virtually nothing. They are forced immigrants, and this is what this Jewish community was. Very few of them could be considered immigrants, but we now, these misnames produce them. But of course, they are important aspects of the Arts Council. I'm going to lose the name of it, etc. But the opera company down Glyndebourne, the Edinburgh Festival, huge numbers of major art institutions and cultural operations are made, like the publishers as well as Phaidon, are the responsibility of the initiatives of this wave of immigration. Now, one of the books I want to show you quickly to get on is that they published was called 500 Self-Portraits, iterating this idea that art history is a history of individual artists. Okay, and this is the first book they published in English, and this please just move on. Yes, these are the images, because in 1937 they published a book which had lots of women in it. Here they all are. These are all the self-portraits from Italian Rossi, Maria Robusti, Tintoretto, Sufism, Anguissola, Carriera, Kaufmann, Lisiewska, Terbusch, Gaskell, Lisiewska, Williard, Vigée Lefranc, Kollwitz, Lutzenbecker, and René Sintenis. So here are the images that we find in Rosenau's book. She obviously used it. Come on. Okay. Why does this take so long? I have a bad relationship with this computer for sure. Come on. Okay. So there are you would have seen lots more. Okay. So it's clear that it's available. So what I want you to understand is as of 1944, no one was ignorant of women as artists. Right? You've probably been told a story that, women were forgotten. And in the last 5 years, at least, there have been hundreds of shows of rediscovering women artists. Oh, forgotten women artists. Now, if you call people rediscovered or forgotten, it means somebody had to go and find them, or that somebody forgot them. And that means they're tainted. They never were so just there that you just wrote about them. Right? So it's a very troubling, that terminology. But these are just some indications of all the way through the 19th century in English and in German. We'll see in a moment. These publications are indicating this is the first century in which people are writing about art history, the first century in which women are absolutely recorded. And down there, before the internet, those of us who were scholars in that poor 1970s, we went to books like Tima Becker and Benezit. They were the kind of hard copy version of Wikipedia, written by scholars. All you had to do is go and look. I started doing some research on women who exhibited in the Royal Academy and the Salon. And when I got to the B's, I thought I'll never afford to pay for the cards that I'm going to write each name on. So many that I do find. So this is a really important aspect of understanding how that moment in 1950, when Gombrich writes and gets away with writing the story of art, is blotting out for the next generation a problem, the names. And we'll just give you some of the French ones, and even up to this one, which was published in 1928, Die Frau als Künstlerin, which means woman as artist. So this documents something extremely important. But the computer doesn't. This is like that program. The computer says no. Okay, I'm not going to move on. Okay. So the artist women discussed by women in art are quite interesting because they range from the Middle Ages through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, right up to the present, including a number of queer artists, a number of artists working in different methods, and this particular image, a Russian artist who created that great structure there, but also including contemporary abstract painters from Bihar, Santal painters, which is a very long tradition of all the women do abstract paintings on the houses. So an interesting combination. Let's get rid of her again and go on. I don't understand this at all because it's okay, we just do
that's going
okay.
2 minutes.
Okay, let's go back. Okay. Now, where this matters to me, and I hope you're beginning to see this as takes a little bit about a laying out, etc., to plot this in. So in 2002, a very distinguished art historian talks about this generation of the migrants. And as you can see, something from the names Niklaus, we've got Gombrich, Niklaus Pesner, Fritz Axel, Johannes Wilder, Edgar Wind, Rudolf Wittgewer, who is the author of this mighty tome. He mentions them. So that is the great array. And that's what a lot of people will teach you. These are the founding fathers of the discipline. But as you can see now, no. In Volheim's canon of refugee scholars that shaped British art history intellectually after 1933, there are no women art historians. Now, this makes me exceedingly nervous because although I had a nice introduction from Elspeth, whom I'm sure we'll never forget, but we had a long history because we've worked together for many years, but I am convinced that none of us who've been feminist art historians will be recorded or be taught in the same way that that kind of reverential respect for male scholars will happen, right? There'll be always a little section, feminist art history, right? Or you can mention Griselda as part of feminist art history. You don't have to read her. Great long books, much too tedious, much too demanding, okay? But they wipe out the sense that there's always been a history of men and women working side by side, straight and queer, trans and all the rest of it in art history. But we create a kind of patriarchal canon of art as much as we do of this. Many of these are, again, also refugees or forced migrants, transformed and become part of the European and the Anglophone tradition because of fascism. Gertrude Bing, Stella Cramrich, who became a professor of Indian art, appointed by the Indians in Calcutta in the 1920s, and one of the examples. Erika Tietze Conrad, Margaret Beard is a medievalist, Ivan Spong, a specialist in Old Master prints, Gisela Richter, one of the great classicists of all time, Georgiana Goddard King, who rode on a donkey all over Spain and documented the whole history of Spanish architecture, and particularly Spanish Romanesque architecture, and Eva Merovitz, who is one of the, if Will Reed had been here, he would have known her, who's actually did her art history about the Ashanti of Ghana in the 1920s and 30s. Look on the interpreters, okay? So the question is, why did British culture adopt the conservative patriarchal scholars? So I'm turning to the sociologist Perry Anderson, who wrote a really interesting article in 1968 called Components of a National Culture. He's from the New Left Review, so he's going to have a particular take on it. But he defines Britain as a very conservative society, notable and exceptional amongst the Europeans for never having produced a classical sociology. Right? Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Peretti, Talcott Parsons, every other country has produced a theory of how society works. But the British don't like theories, right? British society, British intellectuals are sort of hostile to any form of synthesizing theory. A deep instinctive aversion to the very category of totality marks the entire trajectory. So Anderson analyzed which exiled Europeans came to Britain, Marcuse, Adorno, Brecht, and went very quickly away from Britain. Who came to Britain and got knighthoods, became rich and successful? And he describes this as a white immigration. This is from the whites and the reds. So you get Sir Ernst Gombrich, Sir Karl Popper, Sir Louis Namier, Sir Isaiah Berlin, Sir Niklaus Papen, who are all positivists, anti-theoretical, anti-materialists. And then we have a red migration of people who could barely make a living, struggled to exist intellectually, even as they were brilliant, because they were materialists or feminists or thinkers with certain kinds of social, structural analyses. So there is a sociological reason. And then he reads Gombrich and tells us what's wrong with Gombrich, okay, because he displaces social structuring by his combination of psychologization and technique. Now, if you think of the art history you've been taught, whether as fine artists or art historians, or come across in some extent even in cultural studies, this particular focus on what did the artist think or feel, to think of art as a psychological project, right? Now, you probably even get taught this when you say, well, what are you doing? Why do you make your work? What's the feeling about it? Now, actually, in the end, that is part of it, etc. But art is not a purely individualist psychological thing. It's a conversation. It's always a conversation with other art, with materials, with other things outside of it. So this question of seeing art as a matter of individual perception and of technique as the chief motor of only stylistic change severs art from history. Oh, please just behave, this thing. Well, that's what it does. It severs art from history. Okay. You get it severs art from history and history from social process. Right? So one of the things that's special about Leeds is the constant attempt to help you to think, how does art have its own specificity as medium, as process, as technology, and all the rest of it, but how does it exist within the spaces of social structures and social processes? And what Gombrich done is to present a narrative, a story that is not analysis. It simulates time the better to abolish it. Right? So you think you've moved from the Renaissance to the Baroque to the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, but that isn't time, right? That's just chronology. That's not getting the situatedness. Now, I'm sure you're deeply bored at this stage because you thought you'd come to hear about Helen Rosenau and you find it, but you can't get at what is significant about what people write or put in books unless you understand this structure of ideas and thoughts and processes, and indeed the politics of them around. So what she offers is a feminist sociology of knowledge that interrupts this phallocentric positivism. So what we need to understand is what a sociology of knowledge is, and in art as an investigation of symbolic form and social and historical transformation. And she's going to do that through women. I'm going to speed up a little bit because when you look at her books, she's fundamentally an architectural art historian. And that matters because architecture, buildings, unlike, in a sense, paintings, we see paintings as pictures, but buildings are forms, right? And if you excavate down to the bottom of forms, you get to the bottom, to the foundations, you see how people imagined a shape for a form that's going to have meaning when it's built. Right? We don't just need to know whether it's got pointy bits or curly bits. We want to see how the form. So if you think, for instance, of Christian cathedrals, right? Then you think of a Roman temple, right? Roman temple is basically a rectangle, but Christian cathedrals are built on the shapes of different kinds of notions of a cross, right? They're actually literally a cross laid down. Great long nave, transepts, right? Okay, and you'll see this. So she works on two very remarkable structures, but I'm not going to tell you a lot about that. But what you can see with all of this idea about the city or the social purpose of architecture or visionary architecture, or even the vision of the temple, she's talking about these forms that are remembered and repeated and invented and developed, whether they have visionary projections of an ideal city. There are still cities. Architecture to have a social purpose. Can you make an architecture that gives you a sense of a future rather than a present? And is it an architecture of memory? But then we have two kind of books in the 1940s that matter. One is Woman in Art, and all of a sudden she's writing a book about the story of Jewish art, or the history of Jewish art. She's introducing Jewish studies at this point, in which we need to talk about why and how. Now, she has a remarkable pedigree as an art historian, from studying with some of the greatest founders of the discipline. She works with medievalists. She then works with Erwin Panofsky. I'm sure some of you have come across Panofsky, but for art historians, he is Mr. Big. We forget Dora Panofsky, who was Mrs. Not So Big, but she was there all the time. And also Abi Warburg, who is the founder of that library that came to London. Now, in her study of architecture, she is looking at this question of form. And you can see down the bottom there, Erwin Panofsky, her supervisor, writes a book about perspective as symbolic form. You take the concept of space and perspective in art as an articulation of thought systems, right? So that you're trying to understand, is it whether with medieval have a certain kind of spacing, the Renaissance invents another kind of spacing, you have a certain kind of sense of space when you go into any architectural building. These are all ways not just simply of projecting a style or an individual architect's project, but a way of thinking that is materialized in a form that you are going to, your body is going to be shaped by as you go through. So her architectural foundations give me access to the sense of what is she going to do when she comes to Britain. And the two things that she does in Britain in the 1930s, I'm just going to go through this because I want to get beyond it. This takes a bit of time. We'll commit. The two things that she does as a result of her education is to write a book on gender, class, race, sexuality, and sociology of modernization and its impact on women by means of tracing these figurations of woman as a symbolic form from the earliest surviving forms of art thought, like the Willendorf Venus, to the present. And in the present, the world is balanced between socialism and fascism. So to write a book about women and to write a book about women in this sense, at this point, alongside writing books about Jewish art, are, I suggest, anti-fascist projects. Okay, and so I'm going to reinsert her into this all-male situation of the Warburg people. Perspective is symbolic form. Warburg is about how art produces forms for memory, and Cassira. Okay. And there we're going to situate her book within that history. But because that history was interrupted by fascism, we find her turning to do a PhD in Britain when she arrives in the 1930s at the Courtauld on the synagogue. And the synagogue is a form of meeting house created in the Jewish world and Judaism once the temple has been destroyed. So I want you to look at these images. This is from the 2nd century of the Common Era. It was excavated in 1932. And you will probably have had this come across you, the newspapers in the recent discussions, but in 1970 of the Common Era, the temple, the last temple of the Jewish state, was destroyed by the Roman Titus, grim-looking emperor that he was, and he brought back the treasures of that temple. Some of you will have watched, I don't know which one of it is, it's not a Mission Impossible, but it's one of those movies, which is recently about, can we trace the Jewish treasures to Rome? And here you can see what they're bringing. They're bringing it back in triumph to Rome. As a result of it, there is no center for Jewish worship in what is then Roman-occupied Judea, but the synagogues are going to be pathos formula, examples of the memory of a structure being carried forward. And you can see it, the same menorahs and things up there, and these temple architecture, these imagining of architecture in the past. Now, to do this in 1930 in London, as the Germans are poised on the other side of the Channel to invade, with the very great likelihood that apart from those famous Battle of Britain pilots who fought for 3 months in the summer of 1940, and if Churchill had not been Prime Minister, Germany would have conquered Britain. And all of these intellectuals that I've been talking about were on a blacklist. Himmler drew up a list to say, these are the people who will be immediately arrested and deported. So to write a book that advertises your Jewishness at this point is also overdetermined by the fact that in 1938, almost all synagogues in Germany were destroyed on what's called Reichspogromsnacht. They used to call it Kristallnacht. Okay, so this is absolutely timely, this sense of cultural memory coming back and being engaged. So I think her turn to Jewish studies was her defiance of Third Reich fascism, as her name was in the Black Book on that list. She's also dealing with the fact that fascism represents another of these moments of anti-feminism in 20th century history, extreme anti-fascism. Now, we know this in the world around us because we can see what happens when totalitarians and fascist regimes take over. They go after the women, they go after the queers, they go after any minorities that do not conform to a particular idea, a very narrow idea of what is right. So this is Kinderkirche Küche, which was the ideology of the National Socialism. So was a feminist book, an equally anti-fascist gesture and a political necessity. So if we finally get to look at her book closely, you can see why perhaps it takes a long time to put in the place where something that's rendered not just forgotten, but unintelligible, because the whole political, theoretical, art historiographical context is not one that post-Gombrich's dominance of art history is remembered or is taught to you. So how do you manage to go from 35,000 years before the Common Era to a sculpture of a contemporary young woman sculptor? Here's Barbara Hepworth in the 1930s, still doing figurative sculpture, but in 1937, producing this work, which was exhibited in 1937, and no doubt Helen Rosenau saw it and then wrote to her to say, could I include your work of just this, literally this moment, on the cover of my book, to make the point of how to get from to, which is the title, from type to personality is the subtitle. Does that mean progression or narrative? Or is it a tracking of socio-historical transformation? And then if we take this too, and we look at this ancient figuration to the present, right? A figure that only appears in 1908, as I say, and how it is just 28 years after the discovery of the first cave paintings in northern Spain. They have, Lascaux doesn't get found until the 1948, which so challenged the Eurocentric, Christianocentric model of the history of art, or the history of the world, by pushing it back to this pre-classical, pre-Christian world of the painting. And the two key figures that you see in Lascaux caves and the Altamira caves are women and animals. very rare you find a masculine figure. Very interesting. So that is altering the concept of human time, which is going to give rise to modernism. Modernism is going to emerge as a release from the Christianocentric and classical modeling of European time, because this back edge of history has been pushed back, and this resonated with the ways in which modernist artists could then think about form. So it's not a stylistic process of moving from figuration to abstraction. It's going to be a different way that you can formulate the issues that have always been of central concern in the artistic culture, in literary culture, in political thought. How do you manage society? What do you do with eruptive things like desire, sexuality, passion? What do you do around the process of transmission and progression? What's the significance of memory as opposed to innovation? All of these things have to get rethought, and modernism becomes the artistic side of it, not as a stylistic projection, or not because individuals suddenly said, oh, I'm bored to death with with narratives and figuration, I'm just going to chop up a piece of wood. You can't make a work like Hepworth without understanding that that minimal amount of form can still have the maximum amount of symbolic meaning. Not that it's an iconology, but it can do it. The medium and process and mark making and materiality can itself stimulate and solicit from you, which I'm sure your tutors are constantly trying to make you think, not what do I feel, but how will what you're going to make absolutely do what you might desire it to make. So when we look at this, she's taking a philosophical, anthropological question used by Panofsky for symbolic form and marrying it to the sociological, psychological radicalization of what we call modernization. Because something happens in the 19th century which radically does transform industrialism, capitalism, but it's associated at those two levels with individualization, with intensified subjectivity. We become more interested in individuals in a particular way, but it's also a period of revolution, one of which is feminism, one of which is a revolt against the patriarchy. Now, if I use those terms, they usually put aside, feminists talk about patriarchy, what on earth is that, etc. But I hope you've begun to see how that is instituted. And then in the 20th century, in reaction against the radicalism of the revolutionary movements from the 18th century through the 19th century, you get this adoption, particularly in Britain, of a deeply conservative anti-modernism. So I want to just finish with coming back to where I started, which is where we have to go back to the question of feminist art history, because for the most part, this is what it has come to be. It's a counterpoint. I mean, it's not a counterpoint, it's just an inversion of the story of art with men. And you'll recognize where I'm going to go, becomes the story of art only with women. That is not a feminist intervention. That's just a little twist of the Gombrich nonsense. We need analysis of ideology, we need an analysis of social structures, and that comes through the fact, and if you can bear with me 2 more minutes, the role of a number of women in the late 19th, early 20th century in Germany who are feminist sociologists. And this was what blew my mind to discover that the things that I had slowly picked out about trying to make sense of Rosenau's book are actually there as the major interventions by the women who were the founders of sociology. Gertrude Simmel, Jane Harrison, Marianne Weber, and we look at Marianne Weber's list of publications, sociological things. There are about occupation and marriage, wife and mother and the development of law, the question of divorce, authority and autonomy in marriage, the valuation of housework, women and objective culture, women and love, the notion of fulfilled life. These are all tracking the materials through which to analyze the social structures in which women are imprisoned, the social structures which have reason to exist but need to be modified, and the quest for arriving at the concept of personality. of the individual as social structure. So when we look at this contents page, we don't just think how conventional, we see how deep you have to dig historically to arrive at this. And she offers, therefore, when we read her preface, the social history of art and the sociology of knowledge, an evolution of human society and womanhood ideologies of gender, a kind of anthropology of gender, and a question is there anything that results from this historical, sociological, anthropological, and psychological set of structures that might tell us something specific about women as social and psychological beings who change over evolution and history. So there is no myth. And this is where we just need to miss out our dear friend, Mr. Mannheim, but you will miss him, because this is where it will finally connect up with modern feminism, if we can get to it. Sorry, there's too many pictures here. Nice picture of Virginia Woolf, just to distract you for a moment, because Mannheim, as I was just pointing, is the man who supervised her thesis when she wrote this book, and Mannheim taught Giselle Freund, who's a very important feminist. But he also supervised at the same time at the LSE in the 1940s, a book by another refugee, a Czech Jewish refugee, Viola Klein, called The Feminine Character, History of an Ideology, the analysis of the ideologies or the ideologists. You look at that list of these are all the major thinkers at the end of the 19th and early 20th century who are attempting to assert a fixed notion of masculinity and femininity by creating a category of the feminine as these miserable, dull, unintellectual, subservient, bodies for hire, basically, motherhood or wifehood. So she takes apart the major approaches, just at the same time as in Paris, Simone de Beauvoir is going to write her book, The Second Sex, which will do a very similar kind of analysis. So where I want to kind of bring you back together is that this mid-moment in the 20th century, built on an earlier 19th century moment of feminist, radical questioning and sociology, seeing the possibility of change, arrives in a condensation. So the other trio of Rosenau, Viola Klein, and Simone de Beauvoir, where you have to analyze the structures of thought around you that are making propositions about what we would call gender. And de Beauvoir makes this very beautifully clear sort of statement that there are different kinds of myths, and femininity is a myth, or the feminine is a myth. This one, what was it saying? Surrounding an immutable aspect of the human condition, that there are two types, two categories of individuals, is a static myth, projecting into a platonic heaven, a reality grasped and through experience and conceptualized from experience. That's what we live. We live our bodies through phenomenological existence. She's an existentialist. But if you project an idea, timeless, immutable, and necessary, the feminine is endowed with an absolute truth, and to the dispersed, contingent, multiple existence of women, mythic thinking opposes the eternal feminine, unique and fixed. And then if the definition given is contradicted by the behavior of real flesh and blood women, it's the women who are wrong. We become deviant, right? Unfeminine, right? So the concatenation of these three thinkers is a critical element. But I want this quote just to finish with, because she says that if it is true that woman is other than man, or they can be different in different ways, but it gives rise to authentic dramas, right? These whatever difference there is, whether you are whatever you're going to be by birth or by choice, when you are engaged in any kind of relationships with others and the rest of the world, you are going to have real dramas, whether it's an erotic engagement, love, friendship, or the alternatives of disappointment, hatred, and rivalry, how two consciousnesses relate to each other, each of which wants to say, this is the truth, mine is the truth. Okay, these are different. And then each of us, it is the recognition, this real alterity of freedoms that confirm each other, not confining people to what they are required to be by the conventions. And it's the undefined passage from enmity to complicity. How do we develop solidarity with each other in our differences? So to posit the woman is to posit the absolute other without reciprocity, refusing against experience that she could be a subject or a peer. So here's this very radical statement of what feminism is about. It's not advocacy for women. It's to explode certain things which confine parts of the human race, in whatever condition they define themselves as, to a category that is immutable, whereas the whole issue is diversity, singularity, forms of solidarity, forms of possible complicity or difference. So we will end just by seeing how this model of Rosenau's work relates to certain things that we have, Eric over there, and Claudia was here, and Brenda as well, etc., and Elspeth and Jill are probably teaching from 1970s, 80s, 90s feminism, like Julia Kristeva, who asked us to think about different kinds of time, different kinds of temporality, and also Michel Foucault, who put forward the idea of an archaeology of knowledge. So to this sociology of knowledge, we would add, how do certain kinds of statements, ways of thinking, get consolidated to become prison houses of ideological assumptions? And what is it to critique that kind of totalitarianism of thought through an investigation by means of art history? And in order to do that, you have to go back to before Gombrich, before the consolidation of this conservative model of art history, which is still being taught even by the radicals who think they're being radical, because what they never do is teach you the theory that you need to have to get hold of these different ways of piercing the surface of given ideas. And one of the things that's so important about, and I'm sorry, I've probably taken up much too much time, of woman in art as something I discovered by doing this work, from the ignorance in which I started, the lack of understanding. And I kept saying to Adrian Rivkin, kept saying, got to finish this book. And I said, I don't understand. I don't know, I understand it well enough to be able to make any kind of sense of this without, as I bored you with, laying in these very intricate levels of art historiography and publishing and history of the refugee community, and how this came together. But it becomes so clear that the problem we as feminists started to face in the 70s was of recent origin, a consolidation in the mid-20th century of a certain kind of passive fascism that became a norm and is particularly problematic, I have to say, in British society. As an immigrant, I'm allowed to be a little bit an alien speaking back to it. I sound English, but I'm not. This particular kind of, don't use your brain too much, don't get involved in theory. It's an alien concept. Just, look at art, right? And my final image, which I have to share with you because it's a source of such enormous grief to me. Remember, I think we'll just go past this one. Is in this whole era of where we're getting all these things which are making you think you've got a whole feminist art history, but they're all about women artists. They're all in the model of Gombrich. They're not theoretical models. And this is the ultimate betrayal of everything that Rosenau and people like me have been attempting to put into the world. It's not even good Gombrich, because she doesn't understand what Gombrich was actually doing, but it is typical of the generation that we're living in that you have to be wary of this. You need to understand what feminism means. It cannot mean making a lot of money about endorsing the names of artists who are going to be collected by a hungry market and sold and marketed without any analysis of what it is that art itself can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Griselda. We've got time for some questions, and we've got a lot of students in the room. So I really want to say, if you have a question for Griselda, there are no stupid questions. She's a very generous speaker. So if there's something you've heard, a concept, an idea that you've noted down that you want to know more about or clarified or hear out, please ask. Be brave. I really encourage that. But as the having introduced you, I get to ask the first question, and I'd like to hear more about the process of writing and researching women in art, because you talk about at the end of the book learning to read Rosenau, and it seems to me there's a kind of important connection between combating some of the books we've seen and your fear of the amnesia of women artists, women and art historians. But it seems to me that your process is something we can learn from to stop that amnesia. So how did you make the how did you research it?
I very briefly, first of all, I have to say, which is that one of the useful things when you write a book is it goes to peer review, and somebody comes back and says, quite like the idea, some interesting things there, but it doesn't quite work. And then you fall in a heap on the floor and think, oh God, it took so long to get this, etc. And then you just have to say, you're right. Something about this is not quite right. And so the final form of the book is very different from what we actually originally submitted. So first of all, the thing is, how do you do it is you have to accept it's a process, and that a lot of other people have to be involved because they're not convinced. Because when you're inside a project, you think it's brilliant. And then you realize, well, it actually was what it was. Okay, so that's just a very simple answer. The second, more complicated answer is the fact that it's this 40 years, so the 40 years between when she wrote it and how it was forgotten, and then the 40 years of work. So this is a very good for you, got 40 years to go now to that, but that it does involve a kind of form of perpetual re-education of yourself, right? Combined with a kind of expanded vision. And I think one of the two things, which is, if I didn't have this, what I call this transdisciplinary kind of perspective in which, you know, as we've taught feminist studies here all these years, where you might have to read an anthropological text like by Gail Rubin, you might have to go into a little bit of a psychoanalytical things, you might have to read Freud, you might have to understand what happens when people think sociologically, you know, they think about social systems and structures, that what you get if you open a Gombrich book, or you open, even still to this day, what look like, you know, theoretical studies of art history, they're always a specific, you know, theory, etc. But you need all of this, and indeed Mannheim, with whom she worked, was another of the refugees, came to be professor of sociology at LSE. He talked about it as an integrative method, that you can't stay inside what is seen to be your discipline. And all the time, I've always been sort of stalked by the notion, people say, well, you know, you may be an interesting writer, but you're not a proper art historian because you don't write about art in the confines of what is seen as art history, which is style, period, movement, artist, technique, and master, right? If you think that's what the kind of classic categories of it. Once you escape those confines, so if I didn't have a kind of background in one sense in Jewish studies, or I hadn't engaged with the founding of the Center for Cultural Studies here, which meant that I was going to look at these things in a kind of different way. If we hadn't had this very you know, it's why I'm ending up with Kristeva and Foucault, who they are not art historians, but between their two kind of ways of thinking that have really shaped the model that I have. So I think the answer is you have to become aware that this idea of syncretic thinking complex systems. And when I got through that for myself in these different ways, I suddenly could make sense of, I mean, this is a joke really just for some of the people's staff here, but Richard Checkett was, when I was still here, kept saying, you know, we must teach Riegel on the social history of art. And I kept thinking, oh God, not another of these kind of great white guys, you know, etc. But then, of course, who writes about Riegel but Mannheim, who writes a whole essay on this. And then he and Panofsky are all talking about the Riegel idea that there's a Weltanschauung, a kind of a world, a mentality that shapes a whole period. Right? And all parts of a kind of the ways that people think, from whether it's the philosophy at the top to the humblest of the pots that they're making in the late Roman period, there's something in that world view that they are all sharing across classes and city and country that gives you an access to a particular way of thinking that takes all these different forms in a period. So, you know, if you're doing an analysis of the present, you know, what is the Weltanschauung, this global view that means that we are all connected, and even we're doing different things in ways that we don't recognize, right? But certainly it will be smartphones, digital media, probably AI, that this is transforming the possibilities of the way things. So even as I showed you the Tima Becker, you know, and compared with Wikipedia, right? The model of just, you know, get on there and find out, you know, oh, I don't know about that name. That doesn't mean anything. As opposed to the modes of research we used to do. These mean that we. So I feel I have to go to Rich and say, I finally recognized why you have to teach Riegel, but you can't just teach Riegel as a master. You have to say, how is it that they were asking themselves this question in the 19th century, early 20th century, that somehow to make a cultural history, you have to understand that there are all these different parts, but they somehow connect, but they're not homogeneous. They connect in their diversity. They connect in their the dissonance is within a single culture, right? So I think that that's the most important thing that I have spent, you know, I think 43 years at Leeds by the time I retired. I was in a position to pick up on things that were going on in this book, but also realize all the things that I had closed my mind to out of prejudice for being, you know, a social historian of art or a feminist or psychologist. You know, I had to actually return to this tradition of thinking and work out how to have a relationship with it. But then within that, I suddenly saw where what was possible up until 1930. So just have to say, Mannheim was teaching sociology of gender in Frankfurt University in the 1930s. And many of his PhD students were art historians who came to work with him because they needed a synthetic model, including, you just passed it, Giselle Freund, a very famous photographer who just did her PhD with him. So I think that's the thing, that if you're trained as an art historian, you're trained to investigate historically, but you also have to keep thinking, what don't I know? What have I closed my mind to? What areas do I need to say? And now you've got Wikipedia. I can just go and say, who was Karl Mannheim? Why would I be interested? And then you go off and you plow your way through his thesis on the Weltanschauung. Not quite in German. I had it on the side, Brenda, but I didn't do it in German. But you suddenly think, okay, now I can work with that. But you have to work with a range. And keep going back to the fact I kept saying, what is this? You know, why, how will I make this, you know, sweet, you know, lovely little book? What will I do to kind of get it to become legible to me? So you have to kind of meet it. So you have to go behind it to do the historical work, but you still have to use your presentness, your alertness to its difference, and to, you know, as I was saying, you know, obviously the sound of, you know, gender debates in the present make you say, you know, what am I going to do with this woman, wives, motherhood? But you dig, you just keep digging and find, okay, this is not stupidity of the past to be dull in relation to our sophisticated ways of worrying about things. They're thinking them differently, and that will give us light to think now.
That's really interesting. So Wikipedia, but not just the names, going beyond.
You have to go and you have to struggle with, you have to make the ideas your own, not as a you don't have to be a specialist, but you have to grasp enough to know what that intervention was. And then you may run off and say, for the moment, I can take these 3 sentences and I'll do something with them, right? So it's not that you feel overwhelmed, I've got to read all of Freud. Even just those quotations from de Beauvoir I put up.
Yeah.
There's enough there for you to write a whole essay about trying to make sense of, put that to work for you.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions from the audience? We'll start with Eric.
Hi.
Thank you, Griselda. We miss you. It reminded me that we miss you. That was so wonderful. That was a really wonderful gift. And so inspiring and full of to think about. I don't even know where to begin. It was beautiful sort of self-portrait of your art, which was only one of the things, because it was also so trans. You were doing what you've just been talking about in such a magnificent way. It was really lovely, wonderful to hear. I was just even thinking your gesture of just your relationship to this little book. Just that itself is something really informative about when you're doing what you're talking about. When you take this thing, which, at the end, I haven't read the book, but it's you as much as her.
Yes, I'm
rethought her in this incredibly generous and also self-interested way. You're also doing your thing, and you're also inventing what our today's way of thinking is, right? You're also describing some of the problems. That's one of the things I'd like to ask you about ultimately, is what is your diagnosis of our moment? But I also feel that it's a period of cultural sphere has a way of thinking, a paradigm of thinking, a worldview, but the kind of thing you've just done is also, transforming it, displacing it, intervening in it. So it's not it sounds depressing, but listening to you is quite
well, you see, yeah,
happy to hear you.
That's very sweet of you, Eric. And I do it does actually make up one thing, which is, the significance of language. Again and again and again, it comes back to, going back to women, art and ideology, calling it old mistresses and picking up on the fact that these 2 people in Baltimore said there isn't an English equivalent for the term of reverence that we call an old master. An old mistress is a cast-off lover, right? And if any of you are Spanish, it's been translated, there's been a big exhibition in Madrid called Maestras. Now, maestras in Spanish means teachers, right? So masters are actually really, that they are the teachers, okay? But to be a feminine one would be queridas. Querida is my lover. So you can't do the pun in Spanish. So they've ended up with these things of feminizing teachers, which works in a Latin language like that. But at the same time, we're not wanting to repeat the notion of old masters, that there are these great canonical figures. So I think the one thing I would convey, which is learning to write and learning language and paying incredible attention to things and assuming that they do make sense, but you don't have the tools yet, but you may have to go and get them. So I think that's the essential aspect of the model that I use, in which then writing is also the process of discovery. You don't collect information and write it up, because once you sort of got your brain fed with various things, hopefully it does, it is written. So I look at these books and I think, I don't recall writing them. I do recall all the sort of process, but the writing is a very interesting thing that happens when you sort of seep yourself in something, but you have certain tools to do it. So what am I looking at? You know, just like, okay, what does it mean to put this on the cover? How would I begin to use my art historical notions to understand those? So when was this made? But then the question came to me, when was it discovered? And once you make that link, it's discovered in 1908, 1878 is Altamira. You think of Herbert Reed, who founded this department. One of his books is the prehistoric art. You know, why is Picasso going off to Spain to study, you know, when he's trying to get out of one thing and into Cubism, right? That archaeological consciousness, which is at the back of modernism, does something. So it's just simple Sherlock Holmes. You know, it's deduction. You deduce, but you also then have to make an abduction. You have to say, oh, because of that, then what happens? And I think this breakthrough into seeing, you know, it's not just a matter of denouncing Gombrich, chomp, 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 but in a sense, understanding the damage that a certain kind of easy knowledge does. So the Katie Hessel case is example. I mean, Katie Hessel gets, Book of the Year from the New York Review of Books or whatever it is, Book of the Year from Waterstones, sold possibly 1 million copies already of complete and utter exploitative. She doesn't reference any of the big books that I read, any of the research of anybody else. And coming back to your final point, what is the diagnosis of our present? Which is, the less you think, the more money you will make. The less you trouble anybody. And yet we are deeply invested in making art or in thinking about art, in being troubled, being challenged, being shifted into thinking it wasn't always like this, or I don't understand this, or this doesn't make sense to me. I'm going to have to do the work. And I've always taught my own students, you just start by looking at, so like with the Barbara Hepworth, I can read 1 million books about telling me what she was doing and why she was doing it. But the crucial thing is, what is it? And at what stage in life, in history of art, could you simply do something like that? And why does it on a twist? And why does it slightly bulbous at a certain point? And why is it that angle? Okay, and what do those quite simple elements of its physicality? Why is it on a square block? How tall is it? What is my body going to feel when I encounter it? Why is it different from the work that she does at the, she puts at the end, this one, right? How did you get to that notion that you could think two-ness, right? And then you've got the tools to begin to think in a way that isn't derivative and repetitive. So this is where it is crucial that you never use AI for anything you ever write, because if you do it, you will never learn the problem of thinking and the pleasure of just puzzling something out for yourself. Because however unsophisticated it may feel, it's at least part of the process. So it took me 40 years. So when I wrote Old Mistresses, Rosie was an editor. She was a journalist and worked with Fred. I can generate, as you can see, words. Far too many, whatever. But I always worked with people who were able to take this net that I can throw around things and produce words and write them down and then edit them down. And I learned from them, how to make it readable and slow and all the rest of it. And you have to do that, but you have to let your brain and your language do the work. Otherwise, you've learned nothing. And I think that is one of the most kind of treacherous arenas we've entered into, of anxiety about success, which minimizes, in a sense, the sheer pleasure and the pain that goes with it of discovering something for yourself by doing the process of writing and reading and puzzling. And I think it's a really, really, that's the only thing that I did this all alone.
So I think the book evidences that work as well in the bibliography that you reconstruct, and then biographies of the different thinkers.
Oh,
And so this kind of book is really kind of shows that process as well.
Well, yeah, because there's a whole chapter on why write an essay about a bibliography that isn't there. Well, first you have to put it together, and then you say, who are all these people?
Yeah.
Right. And so I did it by date. You know, is she using works, you know, how many works from the 19th century? Is that when all the anthropology starts, you know, in the 1920s, when that's all the psychoanalytical work since? And then you suddenly discover, as I say, I just did these little portraits of people and found that art history was, you know, full of men and women, different kinds, writing together, but we selectively. So that the conclusion is, in one sense, is that the 20th century became increasingly patriarchal. Right, and is still in that place. Yeah.
Can I ask you about that? Because in one of the books that you showed that I bought decades ago, Women Painters from 1908, which is a beautiful big top book. So what did it just mean, that comment you made about actually the 20th century becomes increasingly patriarchal, and yet a book like that is still called Women Painters? It's not Painters. So there's still a distinction being made between actually the sex of the painter, the filter. How then, if your argument is that erasure comes later, but differencing was still taking place, and what sense do you make then of a book which was, in fact, an incredibly elaborate, big coffee table, very expensive book?
Yeah.
Beautiful reproduction.
Yeah.
So this was not a household copy. This. I mean, I have no idea. I've never done my historical research myself to find out who was buying this book and what was its publication numbers, because that would be interesting to know. But you can just see in 1908 the quality of it, cloth bound, very big, early coffee table book for Edwardian households of a certain intellectual class who wanted to avail themselves of certain knowledge about painting, and specifically women painting. Presumably then we have to be distinguishing women painters from men painters, because it's not a book called an encyclopedia of painters.
Absolutely, well said, because that is, you know, one of the problems now, that the concept of women painters as of the 2010s and 20s, you know, is a classification that is being directed by a market, that there's increasing market for women painters because they were so, or women artists because they were so, their financial value was so depressed by their lack of cultural value, but somehow they're acquiring something. So everybody's trying to have women on their books. I mean, I get a kind of ping every 15 minutes from another gallery that says, we are now representing yet another woman. So as of now, I say artist women, artist men, you know, to try and to put the focus on artists rather than on the qualifier. The 19th century is different because at that point, those writings are symptomatic of the moment of 19th century feminism, in which the sociology of gender and the debates around it are producing a desire for the inclusion or acknowledgement, right, of spheres, right? So it's still thought about as two spheres, right? But it's being driven by the challenge of women to the two spheres, right? So it's these books are published as an acknowledgement.
Because actually that book is in fact, as I remember it, it is authored by a woman as well.
No, the big
top one is actually
the big one, and that's Walter Sparrow. Well, yeah, there will be, because you have had, you know, 100 years of women intellectuals challenging the patriarchal system politically and theoretically and theologically. You've had a women's Bible, you've had women's movements, you've got women archaeologists, I mean, women breaking into all this professions, etc. So in one sense, the function of the word woman in the 19th century is different from it, you know, subsequently, but it's still going to take until the mid 20th century with these, you know, Viola Klein and Rosenau and indeed de Beauvoir to say, okay, we've now got to look at it through another set of lenses in order to ensure that it's not remaining this mythic, fixed idea, right? But you've got, so I mean, I think you hear in the 19th century the mobilization of the word women by women as a category of its own diversity, right? Which is why you want to look at all these women painters, because each one is different, right? Whereas when you corral them all into a 20th century book, the tendency is to say that's what they have in common, not what makes them different. So you have to do the historical research into the terms in which woman is mobilized politically from the vindication of the rights of women, which is to say we have to summon women onto the political stage in their name as women, because it's in their name as women they have been exiled from it, right? Then by the time we get to the state of some kind of political emancipation, I mean, there's one conference that I talk about in the middle of this book, which happened in the 1940s, when a whole lot of very, very highly intellectual women got together, who are now very high political and otherwise groups, to say, well, do we think there is anything specific? And they look into the figures of how many crimes are committed by women. You know, are they less criminal? Are they less violent? Are there fewer of them in prison? You know, and they go through a number of different categories to see if there's any data which can say that it matters, and it matters positively in such a way that if we could prove that it matters positively, we could then mobilize that politically to say we have to have more input from women into legislation and into leadership and into political thinking, right? But then you immediately going to turn around and say, well, anybody who can get involved in any of those roles can be, in a sense, normalized within the social processes of being it. So women can become absolutely, horrible leaders, right? Doesn't mean that you're being a woman makes you that, but it's this question of the politicization or political usage of certain things which may be researchable, right? Which are not based on attributing a given identity, right? And so it's this constant sense of the singularities and diversities within any group, because I mean, men don't think of themselves as a lump, right? They may think of a certain kind of solidarity, right? And we do know systematically that statistically that certain kinds of things are more done by people called men, but do they do it in their name as men, or is it conditioned by a whole set of other features that precipitate certain people to be more predatory, criminal, power hungry, or whatever? But we are, I think, in a moment where it's, and I think amongst you is probably very much more confusing, because the concept of gender was created by feminists to identify a social process by which the division of human beings into largely, predominantly two groups, who are then mobilized by society for certain processes, particularly reproduction and the transmission of property, which is why I say marriage and childbearing becomes these two things that societies try to regulate and control. But beyond that, we get into the question is there anything that constitutes a sufficient commonality to make, discrimination on grounds of making a difference between men and women justifiable, right? And the same is true, I mean, race, gender, sexuality, we kind of have hypostasized, we sort of made these into blocks so that they are badges, tick, 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 but they're not, they're lived and complex entanglements, right? And that's why I love the Simone de Beauvoir, which is, there's all sorts of elements of negotiation of any set of relationships that any one or two people or groups of people have to each other that are existentially to be processed. But certainly the question of where gender is used now is, you have one, or you change it, right? That's not anything to do with feminist theory at all, right? That's a contemporary problematic of the concept of identity, right? But classic feminism isn't interested in identity. It's interested in social processes, structures, situatednesses that give rise to ways of thinking and doing and being. So I think feminism is going to be a help in that. So we'll just move Judith Butler and Co off stage and go away, because that's become a very disturbing fixity that then means that, you know, you either kill each other over how fluid you think gender is or how fixed is gender. You rush up to people and punch them in the nose because they say, I feel it's a little bit more fixed than you. It's just irrelevant, right? It's how you enable other people to live in relative respect and security in ways that are necessary, which can include shifting across that. But I mean, I think that's where rethinking this from a completely different perspective gives us a space to breathe from this. You know, when I talked about this at another university recently, everybody said, well, she's a bit old-fashioned, isn't she? She's, you know, she's kind of condescending. She's not really thinking. I think she's thinking way ahead of you. It's much more interesting because you're getting away from identity into what we think around this, you know, general thing. Because even if you were deciding to change your birth identity to another identity, you're still acquiring, evaluating certain different ways of being that have a certain kind of shape, and yet we're always transgressing them, right?
We'll take this as our last question, I think.
I just have a question
Yeah.
about how we can strike the balance in publications of this sort of like this easy knowledge and something that actually is quite accessible for people to read. Where's the balance between oversimplifying and allowing people to learn about art who haven't studied it in an academic context?
Great, very difficult question. That's right, quite absolute right, etc. I think it's one of the real big issues to discuss, which is you come to university to study and should be prepared for things to make you think, I thought I was quite intelligent and now I feel totally stupid. I don't understand a thing. But hopefully my teachers will give me a way of saying, how do I go about this? So I've always clung on to certain bits. You know, I don't understand all the stuff, right? But I read it, I read things and and then I try to work with it immediately. So that's one of my techniques. How can I mobilize this on behalf of something I'm interested in? Accessibility is a value that is preached by those who wish to make sure that you never think too deeply. And anybody that I've ever come across who's genuinely interested in art or generally interested in knowing about something is prepared to be taken out of their comfort zone to make things. So I think the whole culture industry is packaging stuff into junk. So, I mean, like there's the Frans Hals Museum at a Frans Hals exhibition at the National Gallery, which is just packaging. Oh, he's such a great portrait. Look at those interesting characters. Oh, look at this, and look at this wonderful things. There's no sense that this man was harried into poverty. He lived in precarity. He was hated at the time. His work was thought to be shit. He's at the point of the 17th century, which is when the Dutch people are, the Dutch are the great colonialists and empire builders in the world. And that, that little part of Holland, is absolutely related to India and everywhere in the world. All the things that you could say about why are those people wearing silk like that? Why does he have to learn to paint black silk? Right? Why does all the things that are so interesting about Frans Hals, why did he need to find a form to make sure you could feel that silk or that lace or that quality of wealth or that body disposition, if you're sitting there like that? Why are all these things going on? Now, I could make it interesting to people, right? Because, ordinary people think about the cost of things, So I think what we call accessible is actually narrowing down what people are allowed to think. And they keep telling you about, this is a great artist. So it's like I'm constantly getting on about this, the Van Gogh problem, which is everybody goes right, they never question for 1 minute that he wasn't. He was truly terrible painter. He was truly terrible, because you can copy a Van Gogh more or less stroke by stroke by stroke. You use the right pigments, you can get the same kind of things, etc. This is going off in a drink, but that question of what, you know, he is there because it's so easy to like those pictures. Nobody loves Cézanne like that. Nobody does an immersive experience in London at £55 to get it on Cézanne, right? An immersive experience of Jackson Pollock, you would be completely crazy. So, because that isn't accessible, it needs you to make some steps, right? These are people who spent 40 or 50 years. I mean, Cézanne stood on that outside that Mont Saint-Victoire, asking himself, how on earth a single mark that I make could catch anything of what I'm experiencing? How do I make 50 kilometers into the mountaintop work? I mean, it took him hours, years, every day trumping out there, every day coming back thinking, shit, God, this is but he stuck with it. And if you do something like that, you have to do the work to accept it. So I don't think art is accessible. I think it's incredibly complex. And you can make it accessible by telling a little biographical story about, you know, Artemisia Gentileschi was raped, and then she, well, you know, she just got a little bit angry and she made these paintings about killing these people, etc. And off, you know, that is just gossip. I know I quoted that in my Killing Men and Dying Women, that question, this idea that art history is gossip for the most part. And it's gossip now in the service of an incredibly expanding market, based on how you devalued women and suddenly everybody can speculate. Did you see the abstract painting exhibition at the Whitechapel? In anybody go to that, etc.? 40% of the paintings there were in from one foundation. A foundation by a hedge funder who was told, invest in women artists and your children will be rich, because slowly the prices will go up, and by the time they want to sell off the collection, this investment will have returns. Now, that's nothing to do with asking the question, why should I look at these pictures? Why should I know about what women's bodies, when they're in action making work, could tell me about the complexity of the world? So I don't think art history is a simple subject. I think it's the most difficult. And I don't believe I'm intending to write accessibly. I'm intending to write intelligibly, but you have to make the effort, because some of the things I'm going to write about and some of the words I'm going to use are not part of every day. But you cling on to a little bit and you say, oh, I'm going to go work with that for a bit, and then I'll read another bit, I'll work with that for a bit. But it is work.
I think we'll have to leave it there. Can you join me? Thank you.